for good.
All right, we have changed into a different microphone. So hopefully it was the microphone that was causing issues and not necessarily anything else. So I've gone with my one that I normally wear when I'm wearing outside tours with people rather than outside tours with a tape. So I'm going to restart where we have at the Galt 6 mine. Without the Galt 6 mine, there likely would never have been a Georgetown or a Hardieville. In 1907-1908, the Alberta Railway and Irrigation Company was looking to expand with a new mine. They thought of going west first, but with flooding on the river in 1908 and delays on the high-level bridge, they were convinced instead to go further north. They bought land here from George Frederick Hopkins, who of course knew a community would be needed because a mine was going to be built, and they started to build. This was a large mine. You can just see the site we're standing on to give you a sense of how large the collieries were, the actual above-ground working site. And it was one of the largest mines in Canada at the time of its construction. When they were planning this mine, they knew it was going to cost about $500,000, and that's over 100 years ago, to construct. It was constructed to deliver over 1,600 tons of coal every 8 hours, and it operated until 1934-1935. When they left this site, they actually dismantled many of the buildings, and so what we see today are the ruins of the Galt 6 mine, but we know what the buildings left were, and so we have some sense of the history here. The tipple for this mine was built by the Wisconsin Bridge and Iron Company of North Milwaukee, and it was dismantled following the mine's closing. It was actually moved over to Galt 8, the mine on the west side, and rebuilt there. The buildings around the mine were sold off, some going to the Huff refinery, some going to other places. But the large concrete structures remained and give us some sense of where the buildings were. So let's talk about what we have here. The long one over here is actually the drift tunnel. Shaft number 5 would have been at the south entrance of the drift tunnel, and shaft 6 here, where the tipple is, at the north entrance. The tipple is north and west of the drift tunnel. Then we have the fan house. The fan house is sort of, you can just sort of see where it was with the fence there. And then we have the powerhouse furthest north. Let's start with the tipple, which is probably one of the most important buildings on any mine site. A tipple is a structure used to load the coal for transport, typically tipping them over into the railroad cars. If you can imagine, and there are some good aerials and some good views of this site when it was in use, if you can imagine that there were 5 train tracks on this site. 4 of them were loading tracks that came up to the tipple, and under the tipple for loading. There was also a bypass track. A spur line for Galt 6 mine came up from Lethbridge, coming up 11th Street North. The tipple also was used for screening equipment to sort the coal by size, and rocks were removed from the coal at that site. Now the powerhouse, further north of us. Boilers in the powerhouse turned water into steam. This was the raw power that turned the engines and the turbines and the compressors that generated the electricity and compressed air used throughout the mine site. The fan house over here as well. When you hear us talk of Lethbridge history, you'll generally hear us say Galt 1, Galt 3, Galt 6, Galt 8, maybe Galt 10 if we're feeling a little bit longer into the history. But you might wonder then, okay, if you talk about 1, 3, 6, 8, where's 2, 4, 5, and 7? Those existed, those were shafts, but they had more value as air shafts than mine shafts. And an enormous fan in the fan house would pump air into the mines for ventilation and air, and by means of doors and other methods, the air would be directed to the miners where they needed to be working, and then the air would come out the main entry. So the air would circulate, and without the fan house, you can only imagine the poisonous gases that are down there, the lack of oxygen. The fan house was an essential part of keeping it going. Well, only the ruins are left. All of them tell a great story of the mine and what was here. And the plan that Melcor has as they're developing Legacy Ridge and they're developing this area is the plan is to turn the ruins and this whole area into a park where they hope to interpret the history of the mine and of the miners. So what about the miners? Now, this mine employed a lot of people over its approximately 25 years. Now, we have a list from 1924 that actually lists all of the people working in the mine. I'm not going to read it but aloud, not all of it, but it'll give you a sense and give you a sense of some of the jobs. When people talk about a mine, they almost always just think coal miner, right? Pick, axe, working down in the mine. But there were so many other jobs involved. There were wipers. They were connected with the railway. Peter A. Dunlop and Thomas Martin were the wipers in 1924. There were also tippers. Think of the tipple tipping out the coal. William Koszowski was our tipper in 1924. And then there's spraggers. Sprags are a piece of wood that you can put into a coal cart to actually stop the coal cart from moving. And we had 3 spraggers in 1924, Thomas Campbell, George Lastuka, and Mike Shostak. And then there were the slate pickers. This to me sounds like one of the most terrible of jobs. It's actually picking out the rocks from the coal and making sure that it's perfect coal that goes through. At that time, we had several slate pickers, Matt Batongo, Alex Cherlenko, Alex Scott, James Wilson, Steve Woloschuk, and Abe Wiley. Robert Christie was the powderman. So, of course, they had to use gunpowder to loosen the coal, and he was responsible for making sure that all the powder was worked properly. Any miner who went down had to have a lamp with them, and so we had several lampmen. Mike Cholick, Arthur E. Humphreys, James Smith, and James Turnbow were the lampmen in 1924. Now, when a miner went down into the mine, danger was always present. In 100 years of coal mining, we had over about 100 men die in the Lethbridge coal mines in the area around Lethbridge. And one of the ways they were identified was by brass checks that they had. And so when you came off work, you returned your check. When you went in, you took your check, so they could identify you by such. The check boy in 1924 was Ivor Lewis. He was responsible for that. Imagine also, we need to get a lot of metal work done. We have horses, etc., related to the mines. And 3 blacksmiths worked at the mines in 1924. Joe Fettinger, James Horn, and Arthur Slingsby. The head ashman, burning coal, you're going to have ash, was Ernest A. Pettifor. Those are just some of the jobs and some of the men associated in 24. But when you look again at 25-year history, one of the very nice things is the CPR took over the mine, or operated the mine, and they actually kept pretty good records of who worked here. They're up at the Glenbow Archives, but there are records. The difficulty is sometimes we don't know what mine they are. We know they worked for CPR, but not necessarily what mine. So we're trying to put together more of the names of people who worked here in the mine. But thousands of men worked here, and it wasn't an easy job. One of the things they did have going for them was a union. And the union actually was very good about making sure the miners had holidays. They worked long, hard hours, but they did have holidays. And in 1917, these were the holidays for the miners of Hardieville. They got New Year's Day off, Good Friday, May 1st, which was International Workers' Day, Victoria Day, Dominion Day, Labor Day in September, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and every year when there was the district and international elections for the unions, that was a holiday as well. I think elections should always be holidays. The mine operated, as I said, closing in 34, took a while to move things out. 35, they were still doing some work. But when the mine closed, just to give you a sense of how connected this town was to the mine, when the mine closed, 75% of Hardieville's population left. So you can imagine, if you're trying to drain a town of 75% of its population, you take out the major employer like the Galt mine. All right. That's sort of the story of the mine. We're now going to move to the second Hardieville school, so we're going to have a bit of a walk again. And when we get there, we'll talk a bit more about the community. So I won't be talking very much on the way there, but let's take a bit of a walk to the second Hardieville school. And we're going to be quiet because we've got to get out without killing ourselves. Find the trail you came in and go back out. I will say I've been on this site before, again, with permission. And one of the things I did last time I was here, I photographed all the graffiti in the drift tunnel. If you've ever been in there, legally I hope, you'll know there's a lot of amazing graffiti right here. Oh, I found the mud again. Does it sound a little better?
Oh yeah, people are really commenting. It's way better.
Okay. Questions or anything?
No, just everything's so cool and all the stage is working.
Yeah.
So Hardieville's kind of like little lives.
Well, I don't want to go much into politics, but we certainly did not give Hardieville good roads.
No.
Of course. It knows we're doing a tour.
Well, I got a question.
Hey.
Bill Welsh asks, while you're walking, why did the farmer win Nobel Prize? He was outstanding in his field. Oh, it's a joke.
Ha ha ha.
Good morning. Oh, I forgot to tell the story of the stupid boys in the 1920s.
You could.
Oh, yeah, remind me to.
Just maybe while we're walking. Turn your microphone on.
As I'm walking, I'll tell you the story of an accident on the Hardieville mine, which actually didn't involve miners. When they were closing down Galt 3 mine, which was the Staffordville mine, they actually found some very old dynamites. And they put the dynamite in a warehouse here on Galt 6 mine. Several young boys, not really knowing better, broke in, and they were 12, 13 years old. But at that time, 12, 13-year-old boys smoked. And as they were thinking they found something quite amazing, they were smoking over it, and one of the cigarettes fell into the old box of dynamites. And unfortunately, 2 of the boys didn't survive that incident.
Oh boy.
So certainly people at the Hardieville mine, there were accidents, there were mine accidents, etc. But this one was interesting that a family member of one of the young men, a relative, got in touch with me. So we did some research and were able to find the rest of that story. So certainly Hardieville mine had accidents beyond just the average miners. As we're walking past the houses, it's been interesting trying to find the history of some of the Hardieville houses. As I said, 75% of the people left in the 1930s, and many of them left with their houses. They literally took their houses and dragged them. So if you look at the old... Okay, we have to make it to the school. It's one more block over, right? Yeah. If you actually look at the old Henderson directory about 12A, B, C Street in North Lethbridge, along 9th Avenue North, and even some 5th Avenue North, all of a sudden a bunch of houses show up in the 1930s. And most of those are actually coal miner houses from Hardieville. When the miners left Galt 6 and went to work for Galt 8, they literally dragged their houses into Lethbridge and took them with them. And so we have houses that show up in Lethbridge, go on to the tax roll in the 1930s, and are usually described as houses from the 1930s. But I'm pretty sure the vast majority are houses from about 1909, and that they're actually old Hardieville houses. The reason I've been able to say that quite strongly is you recognize the names of Hardieville miners connected to those houses, but it's still something I have to prove a little more definitely as we go along. So a lot of Hardieville history is now in North Lethbridge. So we're coming over now to the second Hardieville school, and we'll talk a bit about the community history when we get there.
So, Belinda, their houses, are these the houses that were like ordered out of the Eaton's catalogs?
No, actually, Thomas Stubbs, who was a builder in Lethbridge, was brought out to Hardieville to build mine cottages,
Okay.
again through the CPR. So a lot of those would be the 4-corner typical mine cottages.
Oh, okay.
He built mine cottages in the Crowson Pass and other places as well. Yeah. And he's actually one of my favorite builders. He worked for everybody. He worked for McIntyre Ranch. He worked for the coal companies. And he left us a lot of great houses. Nice thing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Like I said earlier, the Hopkins family did that as well, right? Just drag their house with them. We don't realize how much recycling people did. There's a church from Diamond City that made it to Milk River. Now imagine trying to drag a church from Diamond City to Milk River. No. You gotta remember back then there weren't as many fences. You could kind of go across.
Yeah.
So this would be a very typical miner's house. That's kind of the roof line of a typical miner's cottage.
Right.
Yeah. You see a lot of those.
It's amazing to me that they still are standing, right? Because I don't know, I guess all houses are built to last. So you don't want to say, well,
It's built
yeah.
based on the materials that you use and who constructs it, right?
Yeah.
But some make it, and trying to find the age of buildings in Hardieville is hard. Sometimes the Henderson director didn't really go out to Hardieville, and we don't really have a lot of insurance maps that we use for left view. So it's been trickier to try to find everything.
Yeah.
But slowly. And the other thing is a lot of these big houses now take 2 lots of the old Hardieville. So it makes it a little bit trickier. But one of the beautiful things, in the provincial archives there is the school tax records for 1934, just before everybody left. And it actually not only says how much each person owns, but gives their land location, so we actually have their address. But not as easy as it sounds, and I'll tell you. As I mentioned earlier, Hardieville, Georgetown, originally had named streets. So we had Roy, William, Meldrum, and Maine. Those names were used for the first decade or so. And then they decided, like Lethbridge, let's go for numbered streets. But not the numbered streets they have now. What they originally had was numbered streets 1st Street to 5th Street, and 13th Street south or north would be 5th Street. And they had avenues, 1st Avenue, we're on 1st Avenue, to 3rd Avenue. Those numbered streets were used until the mines closed around the 1930s. And then they decided to go back to names. And in the 1950s, they used names again, but added to the Roy, Meldrum, William, and Maine became Albert Street, Clifford Street, and Frank Street. So we now have a slightly larger community. They added more names. And the story I was told, and again, I can't prove this, the story I was told is how those 3 streets got named. Well, Frank Petta was actually out one day working, and somebody came along to do utility work, and said, what's the name of this street? So he said, oh, it's Frank Street, and he named it after himself. That's the story. I haven't confirmed it for how those last 3 streets got named. In the 1960s, the records show that they went back to street numbers again, but it's not like the original numbers. There's still 1st to 5 avenues, and now it's 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th Street to tie up with 3rd Street coming out of Lethbridge. Now, of course, it is 40th to 44th Avenue, 11th to 13th Streets. Now, why am I telling you that? So we've had names, numbers, and the 3 times we had numbers, they were different numbers than before. Well, it makes it really hard when I want to try to find something. So I might have an old address, but then trying to connect it to a modern address, especially when houses now are on 2 lots or 3 lots of the old houses, trying to find buildings has been tricky. And so as I walk around the community, I have a general sense of where some buildings were. I know what avenue they were on, but in some cases I don't exactly have it perfect yet. I'm not a surveyor, so forgive me if I'm not always in the right place. But we're going to, but I honestly think, wouldn't it be nice to have the old street names back up? So you're on Roy Avenue again, Meldrum Street again. It would be nice to see those up so people have a sense. So as I explained, I'm not always exactly sure, but this one's pretty obvious. This is Trinity Reformed Church, and this was the second Hardieville school. The first school was actually east across 13th Street, technically outside the community, and they purchased that land for the school there because it was cheaper than the land that was selling inside from Georgetown or Hardieville itself. In 1910, the people of Hardieville started to think about creating their own school district. They claimed in 1910 a population of 1,500 people living in Hardieville, to give you a sense of how quickly it boomed when the mine started, with 75 school-age children and 85 children below school age. The Lethbridge School Board actually became involved as the area that Hardieville wanted to create a school district in was actually claimed already by the Lethbridge School District. And the province encouraged the Lethbridge School District to take on Hardieville. And I'll give you the quote about why they suggested it. And it explains a lot about Hardieville history. but it also explains a lot of the bias in history about Hardieville. The province said that the majority of the people of Hardieville being foreign-speaking and their assimilation to the English-speaking people being most desirable, therefore the province wanted Lethbridge to run the school district instead of Hardieville running itself. And so, the school district in Lethbridge took over the area here as part of its school district. They started by busing Hardieville students into the Lethbridge schools, to Westminster, etc. But soon a school was built and opened, as I said, east of 13th Street in January 1912. W.E. Frame was hired as a teacher, and Mr. Law was appointed the first principal of Hardieville School. For that decade or so, 1911, for another decade, Hardieville was part of the Lethbridge School District. And the school nurses and the nurses from the nursing mission even came out from Lethbridge to visit the school. Miss Tilley, Anna Tilley from the nursing mission, commented on a visit that she had here in 1917. Again, 1917, we're in the First World War. There's a very strong belief in British tradition. Just keep that in mind as I read her quote. "We think special mention should be made of Hardieville School, which is made up almost entirely of foreigners. Every child was clean and neat, and the day spent in making calls at number 6 was a surprise. We visited 16 homes, 14 of them foreign-speaking people. Their homes were beautifully clean. Nearly all of them keep a cow, chickens, etc., and even their backyards looked as if they had been swept." So, ignoring the prejudice and discrimination in the statement, it gives us a nice idea of what Hardieville was like in 1917. So you can imagine that we have the small coal mining homes. Behind them there would be chicken and cows, so people are raising their own food. And we have this community which is connected to the school. The people of Hardieville absolutely felt that prejudice and discrimination that came from the school district, from the nurses, and from many others. And they didn't like being part of the Lethbridge School District. They wanted to have their own school division. The final straw came in 1920. The students of Hardieville School actually went on strike in 1920 over dirty and deplorable conditions in the school. There was a faulty heating unit, and the kids were complaining of headaches and sore eyes and breathing difficulties because of the noxious fumes and dirt and dust coming from the furnace. A new furnace was installed, so the kids' strike actually was effective, but almost immediately there was another incident, this time with complaints about then-principal Mr. Martin. Martin was accused of making statements derogatory to the king and country and of being, of all things, a Republican, wanting to get rid of the king. This was considered a serious menace in the school where the greater number of children are of foreign extraction, who in the place the school occupies in the community are there for the purpose of being trained to become loyal Canadians. The parents of Hardieville, though, supported Mr. Martin, and they actually created a petition and presentation to the school district to make sure that he could keep his job. Martin was entirely exonerated of all wrongdoing, but lost his job anyways. That was enough for the parents of Hardieville, and they created their own school district in September 1921. Now, interestingly, even though they had their own school district, they didn't stop the strikes from students. In 1930, there was another school strike at Hardieville. This time, it was because while the parents got May Day off, International Women's Day off as a holiday, it wasn't a school holiday. And so the kids took it off anyways. They went on strike May 1st every year, just so they could have the same holiday as their parents. What they said, if the bosses had a patriotic day, why shouldn't the working class? So May 1st became a school holiday in Hardieville if nowhere else. But for the most part, Hardieville School was run by its school district for many years. It all started to change again in the early 1960s. Governance of the school changed, and it became connected to the county, Lethbridge County, instead of just to the school district. In 1964, this new school here opened. At that time, grades 1 to 8 were taught at the school, and grades 9 to 12 were actually again sent back to Lethbridge for school under a tuition agreement with the two school districts. Around 1970, the junior high students from Hardieville started attending R.I. Baker School in Coaldale, and they were bused to Coaldale. This practice continued until 1979, when Hardieville was annexed by the city of Lethbridge and returned again to the Lethbridge School District. So they started with the Lethbridge School District in 1911, and by 1979 they were back to it. While parents fought it hard, Hardieville School was closed in the 1980s and they all were bused into the Lethbridge schools. The old school here has become, as I said, Trinity Reformed Church. The old school, the one on 13th Street, was unfortunately lost to fire in 2006, and And that building, people have many memories of it after its time as a school. It was used for storage for a while. It was used for bands. It was used for all sorts of purposes. And unfortunately, as I said, it's amazing to believe 14 years ago that building was lost to fire. So we're standing on 40th Avenue. But if we look at 1919, when they first start using numbers for Hardieville, this is 1st Avenue. And in 1919, the Henderson Directory tells us that on 1st Avenue was the Trinity Presbyterian Church. In May 1913, it was announced that the Presbyterians of Hardieville were building a church. They built it in 1913 at a cost of $3,500, and it would be used as a Presbyterian church until 1925 for 12 years. Now, this church, the Trinity Presbyterian Church, of which we have pictures, is associated with a man who actually won the Victoria Cross in the First World War. George Burden McKean was a student preacher at the church. His brother actually farmed here in the Hardieville area, which is why he had come here. In the First World War, he enlisted in the military, and while he could have been safe and secure as a regimental chaplain, he actually chose combat service instead in the military. And he won the Victoria Cross, as I said, during the war, for duty during a raid on the enemy's trenches. He actually leapt over a block and onto the enemy to take out a machine gun. So I don't know if that should be enough to deserve your medal, but I think so. After the war, McKean did not come back to Lethbridge, did not come back to Alberta. He actually stayed in England and was unfortunately killed in a accident in England in a sawmill in 1926. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of Trinity Presbyterian Church, and then you've seen a picture of Our Lady of Lourdes Roman Catholic Church, you might look at those two pictures and go, they look awfully alike. And they do, except for one difference, where the steeple is. Other than that, the buildings look identical, and there's a reason for that. When the Presbyterians decided to close their church in 1925, it sat empty for a little bit until it was purchased by the Catholics in 1927. So it's actually the exact same building, moved a little bit, changed a little bit, but the same building. Bishop Kidd actually arranged purchase of the land that Trinity Presbyterian sat on and the church for $1,285. So they did not make a good deal. He built it for $3,500, sold it for $1,285. The church was dedicated for the Roman Catholic use on 19th June 1927, and as I said, completely remodeled. When the church opened, there were 50 Roman Catholic families in Hardieville and 50 Ukrainian Greek Catholic families here who were using the church. That church operated for 8 years as Our Lady of Lourdes, and then 1934, mine closes. 1935, that church actually closes as Our Lady of Lourdes. So what do you do with the church? Well, they took it to Coaldale. I told you buildings kept getting moved, and Our Lady of Lourdes went to Coaldale, where it was renamed St. Ambrose Roman Catholic Church, and used in Coaldale for 7 years until it unfortunately lost to fire in 1942. So when I tell you doing research on Hardieville history can be difficult, we have one church under 3 names in 2 locations that we had to try to track down. And we were able to track it a bit, but it gives you a sense of why we have a little bit of trouble. Now, if you're looking at Main Street in Hardieville, the original Main Street that was called Main Street is not the street people consider Main Street today because of how things are changed. But we're going to go 2 blocks north and look at what would be considered Main Street today. Any more questions, Hope?
One got answered, just wondering why the kids got bused to Coaldale, not Lethbridge.
Because they're in the county.
And someone answered that already.
Oh my heavens, they've got Ogo Bogo. Take a picture.
That is so cute.
I love it. There was a house in Hardieville. The entire fence was made from recycled doors. Yeah. I've got a picture of it. It's not a great picture, but it's amazing. It's a good picture. And my one of the reasons I love Hardieville is I've got a bit of a family connection. My dad for a while lived in Coalhurst, but his uncle and cousin lived here.
Yeah.
And they built their house in Hardieville with about, depending on the estimate and which family member you talk to, about 80 to 90% of the material recycled from the dump. So they would go to the dump and get the material and build it. And one of the things I found about Hardieville, and one of the reasons I love it, is the sense of community that comes when you're a down and out town is unbelievable. And this was a town where the rules didn't always apply. So in 1953, when we had the flood in the river valley, a lot of the houses and buildings in the river valley were condemned and said that, they had to be knocked down. What they did with many of them is move them to Hardieville and turn them into houses. So they used condemned houses. They used houses that came out of the dump. They used doors recycled. It was just a community that had a never say die attitude, which I have found absolutely amazing. And my great aunt, Josephine Close, was the postmistress here in town for a while. And, well, I shouldn't go into much detail. Again, it's information from my dad, so my family can't be too shocked. He always claimed my uncle was a bootlegger here in town. So we're going to be on 41st Avenue here. And if you look down, the pink building there, that is the old Delmark store. And that was moved out of the river bottom in 1953, or after the flood. And when it was moved up here, the Delmarks continued it as a store. Mary Delmark continued her role as proprietor for many years. In the early 1960s, the name Riverside Grocery, which it had been called because it was in the river valley originally, was simplified to Delmarks. Following John's death in 1978, Mary sold the business and retired. And so certainly Delmarks is one of the stores well known in this community, but there have been lots of businesses in this community. Just trying to find my page here. Anybody else trying to find their page?
Take your time.
Okay. So some of the various businesses here, you can imagine, there was a hotel here, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. There were various different, here we are. There are various different stores. So in 1914, M. Grief was the postmaster and had a general store. William Godfrey had a general store. He would later become postmaster. Thomas Newton had a butcher shop. Now, if you're paying attention, Thomas Newton married Elizabeth Hopkins, whose husband George had started the community. So when she married the hired man, he became then the operator of the butcher shop. Mike Pierock had a general store. William Threatfall had a general store, and Steve Vasilenic had a general store. So again, to give you a sense of how large this community was at one time, in 1914 there were 5 general stores and a butcher shop that we know about in Hardieville. In 1920, we have boarding houses. Joe Fedina has a boarding house, and there are other ones as well. Richard Coultry now has the butcher shop in town, and Jug Lim is running a cafe. There at this time, by the 1920s, there's only one general store, Mike Toporiski's, and Steve Sawchuk and Nick Cherlenko are both running billiards places. Now, it makes sense that this is 1920. As we get to the hotel, there's a lot of good stories about Prohibition in Hardieville, and billiards places would be one of those places that had a bit of a reputation. So that's 1920, 24. Frank Bunat has a meat store in town. Marie Cherlenko is running the pool hall. Lim Chung is running the cafe. John Halufka is running the hotel. Mike Toporiski still has the general store, and Godfrey has the post office and the general store. And P. Galayan, it's a French name, probably not saying it right, is running an ice cream parlor. Hello, Kitty. Are we telling your story? So numerous businesses have called Hardieville home over the years. I'm still trying to get a better sense of all of them, but one of the more better known ones was the hotel. Now this is also where we're coming up with a bit of a difficulty, because it looks like there were 2 hotels in Hardieville. The first one we know almost nothing about. The only reason we know there was an earlier hotel is from the Gem of the West, the Coaldale history book. It has a photograph of what they term an unused hotel from Hardieville. Now, does that mean it was always unused, or does that mean it's just unused at this point? And that hotel went to Coaldale. It's amazing how much Hardieville stuff went to Coaldale and Lethbridge. And when it got to Coaldale, it actually turned into Coaldale's second hospital. And it was used as a hospital in the 1930s. So I'm trying to find out more about that first hotel's history here. But certainly when people say Hardieville Hotel, they mean the large square one that used to be on 13th Street North. Now, we know what that Hardieville Hotel looked like a little bit on the inside because of a man named Sandy Lawrence. Sandy Lawrence had cause to visit the Hardieville Hotel a lot in the 1920s because he was the constable for the Alberta Provincial Police, who was usually up in this area dealing with Prohibition. And he described what the inside of the Hardieville Hotel looked like. He said the Hardieville Hotel has 16 beds and a large dance hall underneath with a so-called soft drink bar at one end. So that's the way they tried to get around Prohibition. It was a soft drink bar. And he was here, as I said, on a regular basis. As I was talking earlier about addresses that make it difficult to find things, this is the address for the Hardieville Hotel from something that APP wrote down. The center room faces east with the entrance on Roy Avenue of the Hardieville Hotel. Situated on the most easterly 3/4 feet of Lot 1 in Block 2, Plan Georgetown 6489Y, and being on the corner of Main Street and Roy Avenue. You all know where that is, right?
No.
So, yeah. It would be really nice if they just used our addresses, but that's not what they do. The hotel was a central place for many community events. There were receptions, there were dances, there were weddings there were meetings there. It really was a central part of the community. To give you a sense of some of the events that are happening there, in February 1931, there was a dance held at the Hardieville Hotel. It started at 9 p.m. and went to 1 a.m. You did have to pay to go to the dance. For gents, it was 50 cents to get in. This is in the Great Depression. Ladies, it only would have cost us 25 cents to get in. So I guess they were wanting to make sure the women came, so that would make sure the men came. And so various businesses uptown. The other thing I've been collecting is biographies. Families have been kind enough to send me biographies of families who've lived here, and I'm always looking for more. You can get in touch with me through this page, the Lethbridge Historical Society website, any way you want to get a hold of me. And so we're trying to find some of the stories. And one of the stories we've been lucky enough to gather, I've been having a talk with several people, is about the Okinawan and Japanese history of Hardieville. Prior to the Second World War, prior to the enforced movement of Japanese Canadians into southern Alberta, there were two southern Alberta communities with significant Japanese and Okinawan populations. They were Raymond, sugar beet factory, and Hardieville, connected to the coal mine. Now, there is a reason that Hardieville had such a large population. Actually, there's several reasons. Part of it has to do with the CPR. In 1907, the CPR contracted to bring in, they wanted to bring in 1,000 laborers from Japan. Because of anti-Asian sentiment, they brought in 370 to build an irrigation project here in southern Alberta. Most of those 370 men went back to Japan after the project was complete. But about 30 to 50 of the men continued to work at other CPR projects, including the Hardieville mine, which was a CPR project at this time. The first Japanese man to work at Hardieville was T. Ishikawa. He actually encouraged and supported Japanese men to move from British Columbia to come work here at Hardieville. Now, their relationship to the mine changed in 1909. In 1909, the local district of the United Mine Workers of America, the local union, was the first in, I think, Canada and maybe North America to permit Asian miners to join the union. Now, the reason I think this was like something different for North America, the first time I read about this was actually in the Los Angeles paper. It was written about across the U.S., and I have found it in many American papers, so you can tell when something is a large story when the Americans pick it up. Usually they only pick it up when we have a riot or something, but this time they picked up the union. Now, why did the union allow Asian miners? This was actually to prevent them from being used from the bosses as scab labor during a strike or anything. So the miners decided that if they actually made the Japanese and Okinawan miners part of the union, they couldn't be used against them in a strike. And so we see them joining the union. Now, even though the union said, yes, join us, there was actually a federal law that Japanese, any Asian miners, were unable to work underground in the mines, so only were limited to the above ground jobs, and the below ground, the actual mining jobs paid better, but they were not permitted to have those jobs. But outside of that, what we have found is generally they were treated the same as the other miners and workers. And one of the things we know about Hardieville, you probably have heard me say several times, those prejudice statements from the province and from workers about the foreign element. Well, Hardieville was very diverse. Hardieville had people from a large range of Eastern European backgrounds. As I said, the Japanese and Okinawan. There were Scottish, there were Canadians, there were Americans. It was a very diverse community. And it really was a community that, for the most part, it all seemed to work. There certainly was discrimination in some respects. The highest paying jobs, the mine superintendents, mine managers, were all British, American, Canadian. But certainly in the community you will find a wide range of different nationalities. So telling the story is interesting because I get to talk about so many different communities. Now, some of the Japanese and Okinawan men who moved to Hardieville did so with the intention of making money and then going back to Japan. And some actually did that. Others, though, brought over their families with the intent of staying. And as the Japanese and Okinawan community developed, a Japanese language school was started, and so was a friendship society. Now, one of the things about coal mining, it was seasonal. A lot of the miners would work in the mines in the winter and then farm in summer, and many of the Japanese and Okinawan families started that as well. Many then eventually turning just to farming, especially when the mine closed. Now, some of the family names remain in the area today: Kaneshiro, Higa, Okataki, Goshaman are names that you might recognize, and were some, but there's a whole bunch more Okinawan and Japanese family history in this area. As I said, I've been fortunate enough that people have been sharing their stories with me. I've also gone through Gary Ellison's People of the Mines and other community history books, trying to find some of the stories. So let me just tell you a few stories about some of the miners before we wrap it up. Two of the families that were here were the Heaton and Chapman families. Margaret Heaton married Tom Chapman in 1932. Her father, Thomas Heaton, had been a miner here at Galt 6, and her husband, Tom, was also employed there. So Tom Chapman, when he got married, his first paycheck from the mine in 1932 was for $8.50. He was under 20 years of age when he got married, so he was still paid a boy's wage. And actually, when you look at the union, there's boy's wage and men's wage. So under 20, you're getting the boy's wage. And he was making $2.50 a day, which you might think, okay, Great Depression. But from that wage, he had to pay his union dues, his medical dues, and money was taken out for the miners' library fund. Tom Chapman, like so many of the Galt 6 miners, moved over to Galt 8 when the number 6 closed in 1934. Another miner we know quite a bit about from the Galt 6 mine is Fred Koshman. He worked in the coal mines around Tabor, Diamond City, and then came to Hardieville. He was the youngest driver at Hardieville when he started. Now, Fred actually thought he would have to work all his life in the mines, but in 1929, he actually got the contract to deliver water to Hardieville. One of the stories I've been finding is about getting utilities to Hardieville. Water took quite a while, and so in the early years, what you had to do was have water delivered in barrels. Fred Koshman and his son Alex delivered water. Unfortunately, only a year later, 1930, Fred would pass away, and then Alex and his brother took over deliveries until the mine closed in 1934. So imagine you're living here in one of the coal mine houses. Your water costs $2 a month. Now remember, that young man in 1932 got $8.50 in his paycheck, $2 a month for water, and that $2 a month got you 6 barrels of water to last you the entire month. Do not be wasting your water, and remember, you probably have cows and chickens to feed too. So you better make sure you're working with your water well. Another miner of Galt 6 mine was Alex Palmerchuk. Now, what's been incredible about Alex Palmerchuk is he actually wrote his own autobiography, his own memoir. He wrote it in Ukrainian. Luckily, his daughter, Rose Primachuk, translated into English, and she was kind enough to share with me her father's autobiography. Alex Palmerchuk was born in Ukraine in 1890, and when he was about 2, so 1892, word started to come into Ukraine about that free land that they were giving away in Canada. When he was 21 years old, his 18-year-old brother came to Canada. Now, Alex wanted to come at that time too, but he couldn't, as he was forced to serve in the army. How did his brother pay to come? Their dad actually had to borrow money from his brother for his son to come to Canada. And what he had to agree, if the money was not repaid, he would have to give his brother the last piece of land he owned in Ukraine. That was what they were willing to gamble for his son to come to Canada and have a better life. In 1911, the brother went to work here at Hardieville, and he actually sent home money to ensure his father's debt was paid, because the debt had been for his fare to Canada, and it was repaid, so the dad was able to keep the land. 2 years later, after he had served in the army, Alex came to Canada to join his brother. He noted that a large number from the village came to Canada at the same time, so quite often you would see, if you moved from places in Eastern Europe, quite a few from the same village would come to the same town, so you'd have friends and family here. 2 days after he arrived here in Hardieville, he went to work with his brother in the mine. His brother knew he was coming, so already had his work clothes ready for him. And he noted that with the seasonality of the mines, as we talked about earlier, it was really hard to survive sometimes when the mines weren't working. Now, he arrived in 1913. 1914, the First World War starts. And one of the things he writes about in his autobiography is that if you had any foreign literature, especially literature that might be, communist or connected to, in any way to the Axis power, or not the Axis, but the enemies at that time, even innocuous ones, it could get you in trouble. And we know that there was actually literature that was confiscated during this time. So some people in Hardieville, he said, hid their literature, but he was living with a group of people, and he wanted to make sure everybody in the house was protected. So all the literature he had in Ukrainian that he could read, he had to actually burn. So he lost all the literature he brought with him. In 1916, he married Helena Vedmedichuk, who had come from his village. His wife then took in boarders, and this is something we find from a lot of the women of Hardieville. They would take in boarders to help the family survive, especially when the mines were closed or it was seasonal. He worked in Hardieville at this mine from 1913 to its closure in 1934. Now remember I said Chapman headed over to the Galt 8 mine when this closed? Palmerchuk wasn't so lucky. He and others were members of the Workers' Benevolent Association and the Ukrainian Workers' Hall. They were considered communist organizations, and likely because of those political affiliations, he could not actually get hired at Galt 8. They turned him and others away. So he had to go on relief, welfare from the city in the 1930s to live. And the Palmerchuk house, which used to be here out at Hardieville, is on 5th Avenue North. They moved their, excuse me, everybody got to hear me sneeze, sorry. They moved their house into Lethbridge as well. And we'll leave the story there, but like I said, he wrote a beautiful autobiography, all sorts of stories. I know there's a copy in my house, and there's a copy in the Galt archives as well, if you're interested in learning more about the family. As I said, I've been trying to collect more stories, and I have pages of biographies based on various things, but I'm always looking for more. If your family has any connection to Hardieville, and you want to have your name and information in the book, please send it to me, and we'll make sure it gets included. As I said, the Hardieville book, once it's been edited and drafted a little bit better, will be going up on our Lethbridge Historical Society website, and being on the website, we can then add to it. What I'm trying to create is, there's no community history book for Hardieville. There should be a community history book for Hardieville. I'm trying to make one, and so help me do it. So Hardieville had connections to Lethbridge, of course, being in some ways, and described in many things, as a suburb of Lethbridge. And what they wanted is, they often did their shopping there. And quite a few of the miners, though a lot of the miners lived here, a lot of the miners also worked in, or lived in Lethbridge itself. And so they actually had the train that ran out here, and that was also how the miners came out, though some walked. And what they would do is they would walk from the end of 13th Street North, where the streetcar stopped, and then they'd walk up 13th Street here to Hardieville. In 1915, the Lethbridge Board of Trade and Hardieville residents tried to get the Lethbridge streetcar system to be expanded from Lethbridge up to Hardieville. How nice would that have been to have the streetcar run all the way up? The mayor of the time told them it was not going to work, and he turned them down flatly. The mayor was Hardy. Naming the town after him didn't matter at all. He said no to getting the streetcar. So what they had to do was walk, continue to walk, but there was also taxi services. We know in the 1920s there was the Miners' Taxi and Matt's Taxi. Matt's Taxi was associated with Matt's Confectionery in North Lethbridge. In the 1930s, they were joined by Patsy's Taxi. Now, it was interesting that some of the taxis were stationed here and then ran to Lethbridge. And Lethbridge made them get a Lethbridge business license because they said you were picking people up in Lethbridge as well. So they had to make sure they get a Lethbridge business license. Electricity came to Hardieville in 1927. So the mine's still operating. They finally get electricity. And they owe Calgary Power their first electricity in Hardieville. Now, it's interesting, the electricity in Hardieville is started by Calgary Power, then taken over by the city. And the city runs the electricity in Hardieville. And then the province, through the Energy Resources Conservation Board, tells the city they can't have the power here, so they have to sell it back to Calgary Power. And then in 1979, when we annexed the city of Hardieville, it's annexed by the city of Lethbridge, the power goes back to the city of Lethbridge. So it goes back and forth. And it is interesting how Hardieville changed after the mine closed. As I said, 75% of the population left. You can imagine 75% of the students left the school. 75% of the people who are going to the businesses left. 75% of the people are gone, and a lot of their houses are gone. Hardieville changes dramatically and has some very difficult decades in the 40s and 50s. It is a hamlet of the Lethbridge County, and then in 1979 it is annexed by the city of Lethbridge, and in January 1st, 79 it becomes part of Lethbridge. There are some debates between Lethbridge and Hardieville when it becomes part of Lethbridge. Part of it has to do with paved streets. When it was annexed, these were all gravel streets, and one of the conditions of being accepted by Lethbridge is the residents wanted it paved, and it didn't happen right away. And they had a Hardieville Neighborhood Association, which they make me happy. They were fighters. They actually threatened to trap a Lethbridge city bus in mud in Hardieville unless they got their streets paved. They said they would just soak the streets so much the bus would be trapped, and there was other disagreements and arguments between them. But finally, they did get their roads paved, and you know, the streets are not completely done, but they are done. But now today we come to 2020. It is 2020 story. I want this year over, so I have to check. And with Legacy Ridge now right up on the south side, Royal View is supposed to be built in a while on the north side. You've got Legacy Park on the east side. Certainly Hardieville's identity is changing. And I know as the Lethbridge Historical Society, you know, if somebody's interested in talking to us, like I said, wouldn't it be cool to have the names back on the streets? Wouldn't it be cool to have some sort of monument, a plaque somewhere in Hardieville, so that the history is told in another way? It's not the only way. We'll continue doing stuff like this too. So that a bit of this unique history of this area is told before Hardieville simply becomes in people's minds part of North Lethbridge. So we're going to end there. Again, this will be downloaded and we will put it onto our YouTube channel. It'll stay as a post on our Facebook page. If you have other questions, if you have comments, if you have things you can share, Belinda Crowson, Lethbridge Historical Society, you can find me easily. Please send me your family histories. Please send me your stuff so that your family's history of Hardieville can be kept. And if you need anything from the LHS, you know where to find us. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Hope. That was an awesome. I had fun. Hopefully you
It
guys
was
did.
really fun. Yeah.
Yeah. No questions?
No, nothing. Just everybody's like, cool.
Cool.
Yeah. To make this into a television series.
I'm still working with Shaw.
Thanks. Happy Heritage Day.